The next panel before our lunch break is Jennifer Whitaker, Anthony Piscitelli, and Domenica de Pasquale on system strain, the impact of the housing crisis on a refugee resettlement program. Emma McDougall and Aleksandra Petrovic from Waterloo region. And first, sorry, it's Mandi Gray from the University of Calgary. So in that order, I'll look for Mandi and make sure that Mandi's here.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Mandi. Okay, great. So we have 45 minutes. So 12 minutes, and I'll keep track of time. And I'm looking forward to hearing your findings. So Mandi, can you share your screen?
Yeah, I'm just about to do that. Just give me a moment to get set up here so I can get my slides. You can see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name's Mandi Gray, and I'm going to be presenting our work on harm reduction housing for older people with experiences of homelessness. Acronym is HR HOPE in Alberta, and this work is led by PI Dr. Lara Nixon, who is here as a participant. She's a clinician researcher in the Faculty of Family Medicine, and this specific portion of the work was led by myself.
More further down, I guess.
Is there Dr. Travis Haig, who's at TMU, and Megan Sampson, who is a project coordinator. So thank you so much for organizing this conference. We're super excited to share some of our work. This work was funded by Health Canada's Substance Use and Addictions Program, as well as the University of Calgary Brenda Stafford Centre on Aging and the O'Brien Institute for Public Health. The views expressed today are of those of the researchers and not the funders or any of the institutions involved. So just as a brief introduction for folks who might not be familiar with harm reduction, but it is a grassroots activist movement that began in the 1960s and 1970s in response to the legal suppression of drug use and the harms of legal intervention on people who use drugs. Similar organizing emerged in the 1980s in response to HIV/AIDS, and at its core, harm reduction was a social and political movement. Harm reduction has since been incorporated into mainstream housing, health, and social services, frequently adopting biomedical models of health and wellness. In these contexts, harm reduction is less focused on directly critiquing oppressive and unjust policies and practice, and more so focuses on the health and social outcomes of individual service users. Harm reduction is essential to the Housing First framework, and Housing First is an evidence-based approach to addressing homelessness that focuses on housing individuals and helping them maintain housing as the primary goal, without requiring that individuals complete treatment or abstain from substance use. This is really in contrast to previous popular housing readiness approach that worked in the opposite way, arguing that individuals are expected to enter treatment or seek support for challenges that contribute to their homelessness before they are considered ready to be housed. So harm reduction has been widely regarded as best practice by clinicians, practitioners, people who use substances, and across sectors of health and social services. But despite its widespread acceptance among these groups, harm reduction is often heavily contentious. So before looking at these ideological perspectives on harm reduction, I'm just going to briefly look at how older people with experiences of homelessness have unique and different needs in comparison to their younger counterparts with experiences of homelessness or use substances. So we define older people as those who are 50 or older, and this is because there's often an early onset of geriatric conditions associated with homelessness and substance use, and this contributes to what is referred to as accelerated aging by up to 20 years. The research has demonstrated that homelessness and substance use related harms are on the rise among older adults in Canada. So for example, in Alberta between the years 2001 to 2016, Alberta's largest emergency shelter reported that clients between the ages of 56 to 65 had increased by 320%. In April to June of 2020, adults in the age range of 55 to 59 in Alberta experienced the highest number of non-fentanyl opioid poisoning deaths. Until relatively recently, there was very little research looking at older adult homelessness, but in recent years, there has been growing body of research that looks at the lack of housing and shelter options specific to the complex needs of this population. So for example, accessibility needs or integrated health supports. Access to housing is one of the most pressing concerns among the population, and this is often exacerbated by the fact that older people who use substances are often barred from accessing long-term care, supportive living environments, or continuing care. In the next slide, Megan, my colleague, will briefly discuss the various phases of the project and provide insight into our research methods.
So the learnings and reflections that we'll share today come from a 6-year program of research concerning the housing, health, and social service needs of older people with experiences of homelessness in Calgary. So the work started in 2016 with a qualitative case study of one congregate permanent supportive housing site for adults 55 years and over in Calgary, Alberta. We use the term Harbor House to refer to this site. And Harbor House is unique because it houses older people with experiences of homelessness using a harm reduction model of care that includes services like managed alcohol and managed tobacco programming, where staff help residents manage their intake of alcohol and tobacco to an amount that helps them maintain a quality of life. Phase 2 of the research involved interviews with frontline, administrative, and executive stakeholders from housing, health, and social services relevant to older people with experiences of homelessness in Calgary. One significant finding was that currently in Calgary, outside of Harbor House and a couple of other notable examples, there are very few places equipped to house and support people with homeless histories and significant physical and cognitive decline who also use substances. For example, most assisted living and long-term care facilities are unable to support people actively using substances, and therefore people requiring this level of care who use substances face exclusion. Phase 3 of the research involved taking the learnings from phase 1 and 2 and actually bringing them back to Harbor House to enhance the harm reduction supports offered on site. This was a community-based participatory action research project conducted in partnership with residents and staff, including a resident advisory group called The Exchange. And the expanded harm reduction programming included therapeutic recreation, peer support, and increased primary care presence.
Thanks, Megan. So the project aligned with significant shifts in political power in Alberta. So there was the historical NDP win, and then the UCP reclaiming power in 2019, and both of which influenced the availability and acceptance of harm reduction programming and services across the province. The UCP stance on harm reduction reflected what happened in federal politics over a decade ago when the Harper government specifically targeted harm reduction programming. One example was that in 2007, Prime Minister Harper replaced Canada's drug strategy, which was heavily influenced by the harm reduction movement in the 80s and 90s, with the National Anti-Drug Strategy, which consciously omitted any harm reduction as a pillar of Canada's drug policy landscape. We saw similar targeting in Alberta by the Kenney government. For example, during the brief interruption of the NDP, who changed the name of the psychoactive substance use policy and retitled it harm reduction for psychoactive substance use in 2015. And then in this revised policy, harm reduction was recognized as best practice and endorsed across the continuum of care. Yet after the Conservative government came into power once again, this policy was retitled back to the psychoactive substance use, removing the word harm reduction from the title. And significant changes were made with regards to the role of harm reduction in service provisioning. For example, the UCP cut the funding for harm reduction programming, such as 2 injectable opioid agonist treatment clinics in Edmonton and Calgary. Jason Kenney has made numerous inflammatory public remarks about people who use substances and harm reduction, which have contributed to the widespread circulation about misinformation about harm reduction services and people who use substances. In short, this confluence of provincial policies have subjected to older people with experiences of homelessness in Alberta to legislative frameworks and funding structures that are not data-based or based on expertise of people with lived experience and others who work in the sector. Instead, they're mirrored in anti-harm reduction ideologies and principles of neoliberal public management. So one example of this is what is referred to as the Alberta recovery model that has been adopted by the province. The recovery model emphasizes the individual actions are required to take responsibility in their recovery and well-being. From this perspective, problematic substance use is a matter of irresponsible decision-making rather than a condition of structural vulnerability, physical or emotional pain, biological predisposition, or other factors, and is used as grounds to justify a lack of investment in harm reduction programming. There's an emphasis on the language of choice, responsibility, and recovery, with the assumption that each individual can simply choose to abstain from substances. This approach is particularly problematic for older people who experience homelessness because of the additional emphasis on labor market participation as a key indicator of recovery. Labor market participation, which is often unrealistic and unattainable for older people who experience homelessness. And is another example of how older people with experiences of homelessness are also frequently excluded from policy decision-making. But with that being said, harm reduction has not been entirely rejected by the UCP. In fact, there is acknowledgement that harm reduction can be used in order to achieve recovery. But what this looks like in practice from our experience doing this research is quite different. So, for example, several research participants at different organizations either retracted their interviews or declined participation out of fear that project funders would learn that they were offering harm reduction services at their organization.
1 minute, Mandi.
Yep, thank you. So some of the key learnings that we have are regarding that older people who experience homelessness, who use substances, experience stigma and discrimination based on many factors such as age, substance use, housing instability, disability, in addition to other forms of marginalization relating to gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity. We see how the neoliberal rhetoric of individualism, personal responsibility exacerbates the stigma of this population, for whom rehabilitation and recovery, re-entry into the labor market, and independence from publicly funded services is simply not feasible. Reduced access to harm reduction housing programs and services disproportionately burden older people with experiences of homelessness and those who use substance who are already struggling to access services and have very few housing options available to them. So while substance use is not often outright prohibited in continuing care facilities, if the individual has recorded histories of substance use and associated behavioral challenges, they're often excluded from receiving such housing options. And that is all for us. If you're interested in the project, that's our website and my email if you have any questions about the research, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you. Zach, Jennifer, and Domenica. Sorry, not Zach, Anthony Piscitelli and Jennifer and Domenica.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay and see my slides? Perfect. My name is Jennifer. I'm a PhD student in sociology at Carleton University, and I'm also working as a research associate at Conestoga College, alongside my colleagues Anthony Piscitelli and Domenica Di Pasquale. I'll be giving the presentation today. However, Anthony and Domenica are present and they'll be available to participate in the Q&A portion of the presentation. So today I'm presenting a paper that we have written called System Strain, the Impact of the Housing Crisis on a Refugee Resettlement Program. And so the initial findings we'll be presenting are from two focus groups that were held to understand the unique opinions and needs of both clients and staff of a charity that facilitates the Resettlement Assistance Program, supporting government-assisted refugees in a mid-sized Canadian city. They do this by finding them housing and assisting with their integration into the community through orientation initiatives and information sharing. And our initial findings reaffirm that the refugee resettlement system is extremely strained and indicate that there's a disconnect between government expectations for and governance of the resettlement programs, primarily due to a lack of available housing. So the sparse, expensive, and competitive housing market has made it extremely difficult for the refugee resettlement system. And this has been especially exacerbated during global crises like the pandemic. So we conducted two focus groups. So the first was with staff members of the charity, and the second was with clients of the charity who are new refugees who have recently settled in Canada. And we employed a grounded theory approach, which ensures that the voices of the refugees are integrated into our findings and the paper. And our findings can be grouped into three kind of broad categories of governance, particularly during global crises, housing, and also integration barriers. So during global crises, Canada has resettled tens of thousands of refugees, and obtaining housing that's available, accessible, and affordable for them, however, remains a significant challenge for both refugees and the local organizations helping to integrate them into the community. Regardless of the most well-intentioned policies associated with resettlement programs, without adequate resources, refugees cannot successfully start their lives in Canada. Previous reports have presented the challenges, initiatives, and policy implications associated with finding housing for refugees, and have outlined several policy considerations at the municipal and federal levels in response to the fact that the refugee resettlement system in Canada is so strained. So our findings do confirm many of the same challenges and necessary considerations, and also provide some more current context of the experiences, particularly over recent years, which have been extremely turbulent. So the COVID-19 pandemic and isolation guidelines obviously exacerbated the already extremely challenging experience of resettling refugees. And these challenges include the isolating experience of quarantine. Often they were housed temporarily in hotels, but often not so temporarily for quite long periods of time because of additional wait times that the pandemic exacerbated. I'm sure people recall the newspaper articles about people living in hotels for so long in early 2020 and 2021. And while these challenges have been made worse by the pandemic, they're not necessarily unique to these times. Resettlement assistance programs have been strained for years, and this strain has been amplified by other global events like the Syrian refugee crisis, for example, which all result in higher caseloads. While local organizations work to adhere to the guidelines set out by Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, or the IRCC, their guidelines and expectations often are unrealistic under current conditions. And so our data suggests that with more federal and institutional collaboration at the local level, this would be beneficial, along with increased transparency through orientation in order to provide refugees and newcomers with a more realistic expectation of what they can expect upon their arrival. And so firstly, staff in the focus groups expressed phenomenal stress placed on their teams, especially during the pandemic. And according to staff, some refugees, particularly during times when caseloads were high, had to stay in temporary accommodation for up to 9 months. So oftentimes this would be times when they were housed in hotels. And so this is quite different than the expectations set out by the IRCC. And in turn, the charity's caseloads would remain high because they were unable to close cases due to the lack of adequate housing. And it appears that due to changes in local reception of refugees, a lack of collaboration in delivering the resettlement assistance programs has resulted in less information sharing, which would benefit newcomers immensely. So the federal government, for example, no longer coordinates the local resettlement process. This is put on local and regional organizations who are working to provide adequate orientation for their clients. But because of the various conditions that have strained their system, this may no longer be adequate, and they may not have the time and resources to improve this aspect of the resettlement process on their own. So these observations, along with the disconnect between the intent behind the governance of resettlement programs, lead us to the second finding, which is housing. So according to staff supporting the government-assisted refugees, there's a lack of adequate, affordable, accessible housing, as well as emergency housing during crises. And these are all imperative for the successful transition and resettlement of refugees. Both clients and staff expressed frustrations with the housing process, and while their frustrations differed, the data does suggest that there are gaps in the orientation provided to refugees, which could help temper expectations of what the housing market in Canada actually looks like. And the strain on the resettlement system, which was exacerbated by the pandemic, was also prevalent in the responses related to housing and accommodation. So respondents, staff of the charity in particular, commented that they felt like their role was more involved due to the less than ideal and sometimes precarious temporary housing models, which they had to rely on due to a lack of housing available in their community. And many respondents commented that other accommodation models like hotels aren't ideal because some of them don't even have a kitchenette, let alone a full kitchen. And this is especially important to consider when housing large families, having that central place to cook and be together is very important to them. And so 2 clients that were part of our focus groups had respectively stayed in hotels for 5 and 8 months. And one cited that when they finally decided to find a house on their own, when they were successful, they felt guilty and that they might get in trouble by the organization or the IRCC. And the emphasis on the lack of housing that can accommodate large families was also extremely common in the focus groups. So one client recalled being rejected, or felt the reason why their applications were rejected was because of their family size. And this indicates that housing in Ontario is often tailored to smaller nuclear families, and in turn reveals this mismatch with housing when housing families arriving from other countries, which may include more children or multiple generations. Many respondents also cited additional challenges related to disabilities. So even some of the charity's temporary accommodation models are not accessible, which makes it difficult for both staff and clients. So multiple respondents explained that accessible units are difficult to find, and it's also costly to modify the units as well, costs that the refugees and the organizations supporting them do not have the means to cover. So based on the findings from the focus groups, there's a clear need for a diversified and more robust housing market and stock in order to meet the needs of the current and future refugees in this mid-sized city and in Canada more broadly. It's also crucial that we work to meet the needs of large and multi-generational families, and that their needs are taken into account, and that housing is affordable and built with accessibility in mind. And so also underscoring the affordability piece is a need to ensure that refugees are able to successfully settle long-term in their accommodation. And this would mean ensuring that their monthly allowance is geared to rental costs and cost of living in the area. And also engaging community members in learning about government-assisted refugees so that we can work to improve social inclusion by landlords and housing providers, which is a piece of the integration barriers, which I'll touch on now. So the findings also show that refugees feel stigmatized when applying for housing, revealing a lack of social inclusion, which could pose another barrier beyond the lack of housing itself. So some of these primary barriers facing charities supporting refugees and refugees themselves is discrimination, a lack of information, and a lack of social inclusion, which means the feeling of belonging. And so staff of the charity explained that they felt their clients were discriminated against by landlords and housing providers, evidenced by frequent rejection of rental applications. Staff felt that because of Canada's long history of discrimination and knowledge gaps about the eligibility and financial systems of government-assisted refugees, this discrimination in the community could be a result of a lack of information about refugee resettlement in the area. Great, thank you. There are many other findings that will pertain to kind of these integration barriers and dissemination of information, but I think that I've covered the findings particularly related to housing in particular, which are most relevant to this forum. So I will conclude there. So in summary, I think that for our project and the focus groups, we were emphasizing that refugees are a vulnerable group that also need to be considered in these conversations about housing and inequity in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you. I have all kinds of thoughts, just spurring all kinds of questions for me. Emma and Aleksandra.
Perfect. Let me just share my screen.
12 minutes.
Oh, well. Hello, everyone. I do need a break. I know you also do, so I'm not quite sure what to do to make this more bearable with a cognitive overload. The conversations were excellent today, and I may impose a bit of that load on you because what I'll be saying may differ slightly from what was on the put on slides. So disclosure up front, my name is Aleksandra Petrovic, and I am with the Social Development Center, Waterloo region. Organization for over 5 decades, working in the region in community development, social policy, and social justice advocacy. One of the rare ones not a direct service provider. So if you can see in terms of public opinion, I think it's really important that we have University of Waterloo. No, go back.
Sorry.
No, back. We're making it fun for folks. So there is University of Waterloo, there is Social Development Center, and there's Kitchener-Waterloo. In terms of public opinion, this is a huge change. This wouldn't have been possible 3-4 years ago in this regard, where academics, municipal government, and social justice advocacy organization are working hand in hand to address one of the most pressing issues in our communities. And in terms of the opinion change in those two environments, I would like to hear from you in the future more how it impacts staff in municipal governments and academics equally, because our call for you is action, research, and advocacy, where we do take on immediate trends that are happening in communities and doing more direct work to change policies and legislation. Next. Just a little wheel that you won't be able to absorb, but it's here to say that the work we have been doing was rooted in lived experience since the inception. Actually, used to be Social Planning Council, was created by residents who saw gaps in delivery of social services in the 60s and created this organization, which starts with, well, what the problem is. We get leadership from people in the community. How do we address it? Again, leadership from people in the community, and we try to go all the way around where people in the community actually present those solutions. And hence, again, we do have a project such as Kitchener Lived Expertise Working Group, working with City of Kitchener to improve implementation of their housing strategy. This also wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. Next. And why it is important, we've heard that opinions, some of them prevail, some of them do change, and we're working a lot more with homeowners than we were in the past. Neighborhood associations, you meet them in delegations at either regional or city councils. There is more and more alignment with advocacy groups and initiatives, and that is really good news for us. Pandemic did speed that up, I have to say, from our perspective. And we're hoping to be able to provide the power of story, right? That lived experience that is not usually part of planning, right? Nor is that type of qualitative data required by planning at municipal level to get us to the place where we need to be. So here it's just a brief 10-year process to get to a place we're at, where people, lived experts, actually are part of decision-making. Because what they have been living within financialized landlords managed buildings is a persisting issue, probably the same time, 1980s, right? And we haven't talked about it up until very, very recently. It takes a lot of time, so your participation in future is welcome. Next. In terms of evolution, how we do the work, this is just a brief, again, trajectory collaboration with the University of Waterloo, where we would bring people that will share stories to inform research in life stories of displacement with Professor Brian Doucette, and then mapping of displacement is the next iteration, where we equally provided funds, but included our staff and community connectors, people with lived experience, to collect and analyze data. And then moving all the way to the provincial level, where with the Social Planning Network of Ontario that we're a member of, we will try and get community connectors, people with lived expertise, to run the local projects and mobilize more people with lived expertise and potentially organizing more tenants. So it's wonderful. It's going across the board and across the province. Next. Again, some of the points that we want to be able to absorb, but I guess what is important is this stories are data with soul. Qualitative data and processes we have in place are taking a lot of time to get into decision-making places sometimes. And there is always this lag. Data we're working with are from 2016, 2020, like we're never right in time what is happening in the communities for the most marginalized, who are, we agree, are absent. And there is no access to justice or accountability at all times. So people who push us forward, want to make a difference, and want to prevent others living the same hard situations, unbearable situations as they are. And not only that immediate point in time qualitative data benefit policymaking when allowed to enter those holes, right? It also is bringing data that nobody is actually collecting, right? And that is what we realized in this work with University of Waterloo. We simply do not have data that would demonstrate the validity and truthfulness of stories we are sharing. And we do believe that stories in themselves are, self-validated, because of everything we've heard today, from women to refugees. It is part of the same picture. And of course, people want to prevent housing losses. We mentioned that, and central lived expertise. Next. And a bit more, just another spotlight on, we really need point in time, real life stories in the moment when they're happening, and particularly solutions, because I read today what needs to happen for National Housing Strategy to be implemented, another document, checklist from the Office of National Housing Advocate, and there is nothing new. Those are things that people who live the reality have been telling us forever. So we really need to catch up with bottom-up, grassroots, lived expertise, and measure our accountability in how fast and how diligently we do just that. I think you had enough for me. Emma, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. As with any online form, the minute I get on here, my computer is not happy. So if I do freeze, just let me know and I'll turn off my video because it has been a little bit lagged. So I'm going to be talking about the specifics of the Inner Suburban project today. And to start, I just wanted to overview what the inner suburbs actually are for those of you who may not know. So if you look to the map, the inner suburbs are the neighborhoods highlighted in the light orange. And as you can see, these are the areas that surround the urban core, which is located in the dark orange. So in many ways, the inner suburbs are defined through their geographical location, sitting on the fringe of the urban core and feeding out into more traditional suburban neighborhoods. But beyond location, inner suburban communities tend to share a number of characteristics with both the urban core and the suburbs. So on the urban core side, this includes a large number of rental apartment buildings, commuters who rely on non-vehicular travel, and in many cases, a pretty high population of low-income residents. In terms of suburban similarities, this includes a larger spatial distribution of amenities and less accessible or frequent public transit options, which is kind of contrast to their urban needs. So we highlight this as the in-betweenness of these communities, which is something that's positioned in what other scholars have called a policy blind spot. So this blind spot has contributed to this area's marginalization and has really furthered the need for research on topics like gentrification, displacement in fringe communities that are more commonly associated with segregation. So for Kitchener specifically, many of these communities are sort of on their last frontier of affordability, meaning displacement from here would mean displacement from the region entirely. So with that in mind, our research was kind of guided by three interconnected research questions. So the first, what are the lived experiences of displacement in these communities? And what forms and patterns of displacement are they presenting in? And the final, to what extent do these forms and experiences differ or compare to what's happening in the downtown core? And kind of overviewed by Alex, we relied on these qualitative data sources that flesh out lived experience and prioritize voices of individuals who are considered marginalized and are often removed from the planning process. So our findings are organized by sort of three major themes. The first being the lived experience of spatialized displacement or physical displacement. The second being the lived experience of non-spatial displacement or social displacement. And the final being that similarities and differences piece between the core and the suburbs, inner suburbs. So central to much of our discussions of lived experience is the role that property management plays in facilitating the overall deplorable living conditions that have and continue to exist in a lot of these inner suburban rental buildings. So contrary to popular understanding of displacement, which positions large-scale investment and revitalization as sort of major driving factors, property management appears to be actively facilitating this displacement through
just under a minute. I'm sorry, just under a minute.
Oh, perfect. So with that in mind, I will jump ahead because we're running out of time. But so we're seeing that property management is actively facilitating this displacement. We're seeing it come in forms of evictions, of harassment from property management that's led right into that sort of social element of displacement where residents are feeling like they need to maintain place, but they're facing harassment, they're experiencing an overall lack of supports, huge changes to the community that really push them into social isolation and transform their experience as they may continue to maintain, but socially they're quite displaced. So just looking quite quickly visually, comparison between the core and the inner suburbs, we're seeing very visual change that suggests this rapid shift toward gentrification, whereas in the other suburbs we're not. But through our research, we found that experiences are almost identical. And because of that, Our suggestions for housing policy are also identical. What we can change in the core can be reflected in the inner suburbs. And we actually wrote a report on this, which I'll share in the chat after, but here are some key takeaways. Establishing regulatory action groups that are holding property management accountable, prioritizing the lived experiences, as Alex said, and ensuring that we're both protecting affordable housing, creating new affordable housing, and then moving forward with renting, expanding rent control policies to ensure that these individuals are safe. So thanks for that quick rush overview. We do have our contact information here. And as I mentioned really briefly there, I'll share the report in the chat because it is 70 pages. We just published it a week ago, and I think it really overviews everything we both touched on today.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting how we started the morning with a kind of high-level look at what is causing house price affordability problems, and then you get into the consequences that this has on these different segments of these populations, which have to be addressed. And I'm left kind of sort of thinking about this question of causes and solutions, and to what extent are the two linked? Sometimes they are, somehow they aren't. What's the capacity of government to kind of step in and address these negative consequences? I'm looking for questions from anybody for any of our panelists. There's some questions in the chat. Allison.
Yeah, I guess I was really, all of this work was really great. And I just saw Alex's comment in the chat here. Hope the conversations, action, research, and advocacy continue. I just wonder if she has any specific calls to researchers, to ways that researchers may be more useful to you and your work, and sort of catching up, as you said, to the expertise that already exists.
Allison, at this point, 70% of our work at the Social Development Center is on housing and homelessness due to the need and what the community is coming forward for. So far, we do continue collaboration with the University of Waterloo School of Planning, and also more recently, there is Wilfrid Laurier professors that continue collaboration mostly through student projects, but there is leverage that can be offered in different regards, particularly on designing solutions for recommendations that come from lived experience, right? So we hear them today, and tomorrow we start strategizing how to make it happen, and not, have this high level reports what, could have been done. But definitely design of solutions. Thank you.
I also, the other thing that I really wanted to kind of emphasize that struck me is the importance of qualitative data as, or the political consequences of what counts as evidence, which is that, so some people are selective, or the system can be selective in terms of what counts as evidence, and that can lead to then blind spots in policy. So Alex, you observed briefly that some quantitative data is actually not being collected. And in general, there's a theme that people's experiences often are discounted, but can inform policy in very profound ways. I think that's all very, very interesting. In the absence of any other questions, I'm gonna.
I think Rob Evans has a question. I just saw a note in the chat. I don't know if we have time for it.
Rob.
Thank you, Simon. I have a short question, and it's probably to the group. And thank you for doing this. This is a wonderful discussion on policy and research and data. In Waterloo, there's a very progressive, very innovative approach to the discrimination problems and the displacement issues that have been pervasive throughout all communities. I wrote that down. Across all communities, the experiences are almost identical, and we agree. Our group has studied different housing models, and there's a few things called the A plan. It's equity in housing. This is something that's available on our website, robevansmayor.ca. There is an election coming, but we're talking about the application of policy and research that comes from in-field work. and it's very interesting. I would encourage folks to look at this, but the question is, when innovation is brought to the table and different policymakers, including elected officials, are pursuing an innovative way to do this, we do need to get some help to bridge the application of this and to promote a new way of doing things. Things like renter pre-approvals, making better use of existing space, not just through densification, but to make better use of underutilized space. This is something that I would be very interested in hearing back from folks at this, through this forum, because you folks care and you're smart, but this is a different approach that hasn't been done elsewhere, but it does show not only increasing supply quickly, as well as removing discrimination from the process. Could I ask for some feedback on this type of approach?
I'm going to ask people to write to Rob directly or put their comments in the chat, because I do want us to get a break before our roundtable on the Ontario 22 election. So I'm going to ask people to put responses to that in a chat or to write to Rob directly for feedback on his question.